In the vast, marbled amphitheater of American power, a confrontation was about to unfold. This was not a battle of legislation, but of legacies, a story of a political queen, secure on her throne after decades of rule, and a quiet senator from a forgotten state, armed with nothing but a single manila folder. What you are about to read is the anatomy of a collapse. The moment-by-moment account of how 38 years of carefully cultivated power can be dismantled in a single afternoon. It began, as it so often does, with an act of supreme confidence. You won't believe how fast 38 years of power can collapse. Nancy Pelosi stood at her committee table like a general surveying a battlefield she was certain she would win. At 84 years old, she commanded the room with the gravitational presence of someone who had spent a lifetime wielding power in the highest chambers of government. Her designer Armani suit, a shimmer of silk that caught the light with her every sharp, deliberate movement, was tailored to project absolute authority. Behind her, a dozen aides arranged themselves like a royal court, a silent, attentive chorus ready to supply documents, whisper advice, or simply reflect the importance of the woman they served. Her fingers, adorned with subtle but expensive rings, stabbed through the air toward the man sitting across from her. When she spoke, her voice was a sharp, amplified instrument, cutting through the murmurs of the committee room. You're a backwoods relic from Louisiana who doesn't understand modern governance. The room detonated. On the Democratic side, members leapt to their feet, applauding wildly. Some banged their fists on their desks with enough force to make water glasses jump. In the packed gallery, 500 supporters, bussed in for the spectacle, erupted. They waved pre-printed signs and began a rhythmic chant that grew louder with each repetition. Nancy. 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 The sound echoed off the marble walls and vaulted ceilings, transforming the solemnity of a congressional hearing into the raw energy of a campaign rally. Across the dais, Senator John Kennedy sat alone at his witness table. He calmly set down his pen. His single manila folder lay closed before him. There was no flanking staff, no eager entourage. There was just one senator from Louisiana in a slightly rumpled suit that had clearly seen better days, his simple wire-rimmed glasses catching the glare of the overhead lights. As the wave of noise washed over him, he reached for his water glass and took a slow, deliberate sip. The contrast was a piece of political theater in itself, her fury and his calm, her adoring crowd and his solitude, her designer armor and his working man's clothes. Pelosi's contemptuous smile widened. This would be easy. She had performed this ritual 1,000 times, silencing critics and destroying opponents with a combination of withering condescension and overwhelming political force. She had never lost. She launched into her prepared remarks, her voice rising with each accusation, feeding off the electric energy of her supporters. An aide rushed forward with a large chart showing state-by-state rankings. Pelosi held it up like a prosecutor brandishing the murder weapon. You represent poverty, she proclaimed, her voice ringing with scorn. You represent ignorance. Louisiana ranks 48th in education, 49th in healthcare, and dead last in infrastructure. Her supporters roared. The chant began anew, a pounding drumbeat of validation. Nancy. Nancy. While California leads, she continued, spreading her arms wide as if to embrace the entire tech economy. Louisiana follows. It follows like a puppy, begging for scraps from the federal table. Your state takes more in federal money than it gives back, while California subsidizes your failure. She paused for the expected laughter from her side of the aisle, received it, and then pressed her advantage. The Democrats were on their feet now, a wall of cheering bodies. The noise in the room had become a physical force, a wall of sound meant to intimidate and overwhelm. Through it all, Kennedy kept his head down. His pen moved steadily across the legal pad in front of him. That same careful, methodical script, never wavering. He didn't look up. He didn't react. He refused to give her the fight she was so desperately trying to provoke for the cameras. Pelosi's smile faltered, just for a second. His refusal to engage was unnerving. It was like punching a ghost. It made her performance feel one-sided, almost desperate, and she knew it. Her attacks grew more personal, her voice louder, sharper, straining to pierce his maddeningly impenetrable calm. Are you even listening to me? Senator?" she demanded, an edge of genuine frustration creeping into her voice. "Or is this all too complex for a Louisiana education to understand?" The crowd, sensing her frustration, chanted louder, as if sheer volume could force him to acknowledge her. But Kennedy just kept writing, his expression unreadable behind those simple glasses. Pelosi's carefully choreographed performance was beginning to crack. She began speaking faster, cycling through a list of corporate titans headquartered in her district, her voice growing shrill as she invoked their names like talismans. "Apple, Google, Meta, Tesla, we create the future while you drill for oil and cling to the past." Finally, after an eternity of her attacks and the crowd's noise, Kennedy moved. Slowly, deliberately, he set down his pen. The small, quiet movement cut through the din, drawing every eye in the room. Conversations dropped to whispers. People in the gallery leaned forward, straining to see. He removed his wire-rimmed glasses with a theatrical precision. Taking his time, from his breast pocket, he pulled the handkerchief and began to clean each lens with infuriating care. As if he had all the time in the world and her rage was merely an inconvenient background noise. Pelosi stood at her table, her fists clenched, her earlier confidence beginning to fray at the edges. Kennedy replaced his glasses. He looked up, and for the first time since the tirade began, he met her eyes directly across the vast space that separated them. When he spoke, his Louisiana drawl was so quiet that the entire room had to strain to lean in, to hear him. "Congresswoman Pelosi," he said, each word measured and distinct. "I did listen. I listened very carefully." His hand moved to the solitary manila folder. One finger pushed it open with gentle pressure, the sound of paper sliding on wood seeming to echo in the suddenly silent chamber. "I heard a great deal about California's greatness," Kennedy continued in that same quiet voice. "I heard about Silicon Valley, about innovation, about your district being the economic engine of America." He reached into the folder and pulled out a single 8x10 photograph. He held it up for the room to see, high enough that even those in the back rows could make out the image. The photograph showed a sprawling homeless encampment, a city of canvas and despair built upon what had once been a sidewalk. Tents stretched into the distance, a chaotic jumble of makeshift shelters cobbled together from cardboard and tarps. Trash and human debris littered the street like the aftermath of a flood. And in the foreground, impossible to miss, a human figure was squatted against a wall, defecating in broad daylight as pedestrians hurried past. "This is your district, ma'am," Kennedy said, his voice still quiet, still calm. "This photograph was taken yesterday morning, on Market Street, in San Francisco." The photograph was a grenade rolled gently onto the committee table. For a long, silent moment, no one seemed to breathe. The collective gasp from the gallery was a sharp, sibilant sound, the noise of 500 people having the air punched from their lungs simultaneously. The rapid-fire click of press cameras was the only other sound, a mechanical counterpoint to the organic shock that had seized the room. Nancy Pelosi's smile froze, a rictus of political confidence suddenly caught in the harsh glare of an ugly reality. The carefully constructed image of a world-leading, innovation-driving district shattered against the brutal, undeniable truth of the photograph. This was not a statistic that could be debated or a talking point that could be spun. It was a picture of abject human misery, in the heart of her kingdom. When she finally found her voice, it was a full octave higher than before, thin and defensive. That's taken out of context. You can't just show one image from one street corner and pretend it represents my entire district." "Is it?" Kennedy asked, his voice still infuriatingly calm. He tilted his head, a gesture of mild curiosity. His other hand emerged from under the table, holding a thick, brick-like stack of photographs bound by a rubber band. He dropped them onto the table with a heavy thud that seemed to echo in the now silent chamber. "Because I have 50 more just like this one. All taken yesterday, all from within a 2-mile radius of your district office. Shall we discuss context, Congresswoman? We can go through them one by one, if you like." The threat was clear. He hadn't just found one embarrassing picture, he had documented a systemic failure. The thud of those photos on the table marked the end of the first phase of the hearing and the beginning of something far more dangerous for Nancy Pelosi. She straightened up, visibly trying to reclaim her authority, to pull the room's focus back to her preferred narrative. Her voice strengthened as she fell back on her prepared lines. "My district is the economic engine of America," she proclaimed, listing the corporate giants again like an incantation meant to ward off evil spirits. "Apple, Google, Meta, Tesla, we create the future." Her aides, sensing her distress, scrambled around her, rustling papers, their whispers urgent and barely audible. Kennedy let her finish. He simply watched her, patient and unmoving, like a predator who knows its prey has nowhere left to run. When she finally paused, running out of corporate names to invoke, he spoke again. "Yes, ma'am," he said quietly, "you certainly profit from the future." He slid a single document across the table toward the center. It was a simple financial summary. Even from the back rows of the gallery, the numbers were visible, large, bold, and followed by many zeros. "My investments are legal and have been publicly disclosed for decades." Pelosi's voice was entirely defensive now. She was no longer prosecuting, she was testifying. She was reacting, not acting. The power dynamic had irrevocably shifted. Kennedy nodded slowly, letting 5 full seconds of silence stretch, each tick of the clock amplifying the tension in the room. "Legal," he said finally. "Absolutely legal, Congresswoman." Another pause, even longer this time, heavy and uncomfortable. "But are they ethical?" Before she could formulate a response, Kennedy reached under his table. The sound of a laptop being pulled out scraped against the silence. He opened it with deliberate slowness, every eye in the room fixed on his hands. The computer's startup chime seemed unnaturally loud. He typed something, waited, the blue glow of the screen reflecting in his glasses. Behind him, the large projection screen flickered to life. The image that appeared would change everything. It was not a picture. It was not a chart. It was just 3 simple lines of text that would detonate the remainder of Nancy Pelosi's political authority. Paul Pelosi stock trades. January 2025. Net profit, $38.000. The room exploded. The gasps were not of surprise, but of shock. The murmurs became shouts. Chairs scraped loudly as people stood for a better view. The press row erupted into a frenzy of activity. Fingers flying across keyboards. Reporters urgently calling their editors. Pelosi's hand slammed down on her podium. Not in anger, but to catch herself. To keep from swaying. Her face had drained of all color. The transformation from the red of exertion to the white of shock happening in a matter of seconds. Her aides rushed to her side, but she waved them away with a hand that trembled visibly. Kennedy's voice cut through the chaos. Still quiet, still calm, forcing the room to fall silent once more so they could hear him. "Your husband made more money in 1 month, ma'am," he said, letting the words sink in, letting the impossible number on the screen burn itself into the memory of every person watching, "than most Americans make in their entire lifetimes." The screen changed, shifting to a detailed timeline of trades, each entry appearing one by one, a relentless drumbeat of staggering wealth. January 7th. $5.000 Apple stock sale. January 14th. $7.000 Nvidia call options. January 21st. $10.000 Google purchase. January 28th. $16.000 various trades. Kennedy let each number materialize and hang in the air for a moment before the next one appeared. The cumulative effect was devastating. This was not one lucky trade. It was a systematic, high-volume operation. And it all started, Kennedy said, his eyes never leaving hers, with information that only you had access to. Pelosi stood frozen, her mouth opening and closing. But no sound emerged. She looked like a fish pulled from water. Gasping, unable to form words, the Democrats on the committee shifted uncomfortably, their urgent interest in their phones and notes suddenly returning. Anything to avoid looking at her. Kennedy leaned forward slightly. "Shall we discuss how legal corruption works, Congresswoman?" The screen behind him faded to black. Then, in stark white letters that filled the entire display, a new chart appeared. It was a chart that made the seasoned financial reporters in the press row gasp out loud, not with polite surprise, but with genuine, audible shock. The chart showed 2 lines, representing investment returns from 2014 to the present. One line, labeled S&P 500, showed a healthy, respectable upward climb. The other line, labeled Pelosi portfolio, was a near vertical ascent, a trajectory so steep it seemed to defy financial gravity. Your investment portfolio, Kennedy said, his casual Louisiana drawl making the numbers even more damning, has beaten the overall stock market by a factor of 4. For every single dollar an average investor earned, you made 4. He paused. You've beaten Warren Buffett, the Oracle of Omaha himself. You've beaten Goldman Sachs, with their billion-dollar supercomputers. You've consistently, year after year, achieved returns that the most brilliant financial minds in the world can only dream of. The numbers shifted, showing a year-by-year breakdown. In 2023 alone, Kennedy continued, his finger tracing the astonishingly steep line. Your portfolio achieved a 65% return. The S&P 500's return for that same year appeared for comparison, 24%. 2.7 times, Kennedy said quietly. You made 2.7 times what the entire market delivered. That's not skill, Congresswoman. That's not luck. That's a statistical impossibility. Pelosi finally found her voice, falling back on what was clearly a well-rehearsed defense. My husband is a skilled investor, she declared, her voice regaining a fraction of its earlier power. He's been in venture capital for 40 years. He built a successful business long before I ever entered Congress. Kennedy nodded thoughtfully, as if giving this explanation serious consideration. Skilled, he repeated, letting the word hang in the air. Let's examine that skill, shall we? He clicked to a new slide and began to tell a story, his voice taking on the cadence of a prosecutor laying out a chronology of a crime. March 19, 2021, Paul Pelosi calls his broker. He buys $2 million worth of call options on Microsoft stock. A risky, high-reward bet. Kennedy paused. 12 days later, just 12 days, Microsoft announces it has won a massive $22 billion contract to supply the U.S. Army with augmented reality headsets. Microsoft's stock soars, and Paul Pelosi is $2 million richer. He looked up from his notes. Maybe he's brilliant. Maybe he's just the luckiest man in the history of finance. Let's see if the pattern continues. The hearing was no longer about poverty statistics or homeless encampments. It was about something far more specific, far more personal, and far more criminal. And John Kennedy was just getting started. Before Kennedy could continue with his next example, a man in the gallery abruptly stood. He was middle-aged, his business shirt wrinkled, his hands visibly shaking as he clutched a folder to his chest. Security officers tensed, taking a step forward, but Kennedy raised a single, calming hand. Let him speak. The man's voice cracked as he began. My name is Robert Chen. I was an investor. He swallowed hard, struggling to find the words. I followed an app, the Pelosi tracker. It shows you what members of Congress are buying. When they're buying it, he looked directly at Pelosi, his expression a mixture of anger and profound sorrow. I saw your husband was buying Microsoft. I thought if you're buying, it must be a sure thing. You're on committees. You know things the rest of us don't. He pulled a crumpled portfolio statement from his folder, the paper rattling in his trembling hands. I bought Microsoft the day after your trade was made public. It was too late. The stock had already jumped. The Army contract was already announced. I bought at the peak. Tears began to stream down his face, but he forced himself to continue. I lost my son's college fund. 18 years of savings. Every birthday gift. Every Christmas bonus. Every overtime shift when I should have been home with my family. Gone. He looked directly at Pelosi, the pain in his eyes raw and undeniable. My son works at Walmart now, not UCLA, where he was supposed to study engineering. Walmart, because you got rich, and I got ruined. He sat down abruptly, his shoulders shaking with sobs. The room was hollowed out by the silence, the profound discomfort of witnessing such a personal and devastating loss. Kennedy's jaw tightened, a muscle jumping beneath the skin. When he spoke again, his voice carried an edge of cold fury it hadn't possessed before. This is who pays the price for your so-called skill. Congresswoman, real Americans losing their children's futures while you accumulate millions. He clicked to his next slide without waiting for a response, moving forward with the systematic destruction. But perhaps Microsoft was a fluke. One incredibly fortunate trade. Let me tell you another story. A new timeline appeared. Summer of 2022. You own 25.000 shares of Nvidia stock, worth about $4 million. At the same time, you are the chief proponent of the CHIPS Act, a massive government subsidy for semiconductor companies like Nvidia. You champion it publicly, passionately. He paused. Then, just before the bill is set to pass, your husband sells all of it. He takes a $700 loss. Why would a skilled investor sell at a massive loss right before the very legislation they championed becomes law and sends the stock soaring? The question hung in the air. On August 9, 2022, the CHIPS Act passes. You vote yes. It's your signature legislative victory. And Nvidia stock explodes. It doubles, then doubles again. The $4 million you sold at a loss would be worth $12 million today. He paused again. She missed it all. Or did she? Kennedy clicked again. November 22, 2023, the day before Thanksgiving, when Americans are focused on family, not financial disclosures. Paul Pelosi buys $5 million worth of Nvidia. Not stock this time. Options. Even more aggressive. Even riskier. His voice hardened. And when does he disclose this massive, market-moving trade? December 22, at 5 p.m., on the Friday before Christmas. The absolute best time to bury news you don't want anyone to see. A young man jumped to his feet in the gallery, his voice shaking. His staff badge was clearly visible. I filed that disclosure, he shouted. Security moved toward him, but Kennedy's hand shot up again. Let him speak. The young man connected his phone to the projection system. An email appeared on the giant screen for everyone to read. It was from Nancy Pelosi's chief of staff. He read it aloud, his voice cracking with a mixture of fear and liberation. File the Nvidia options disclosure at exactly 5 p.m. on Friday, December 22. Not a minute before, not a minute after. This timing is critical to minimize media exposure during the holiday period. The room erupted. Pelosi, her face a mask of purple rage, screamed at the young man. You're fired. I already quit, he shouted back, pulling a crumpled resignation letter from his pocket. I quit this morning. I couldn't live with myself anymore. For 3 years, I enabled this. I timed the disclosures. I buried the bad news. I thought I was helping fight for the working class. But I was just helping you get rich. He broke down, sobbing. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry to everyone you hurt. Thank you for your courage, Mr. Morrison, Kennedy said quietly. He then turned back to Pelosi, the disgust in his voice unconcealed. You didn't just trade on inside information. Congresswoman, you conspired to deceive the American people by deliberately hiding it. That is not unethical. That is a conspiracy. The moral weight of the moment was too much for some. 3 Democratic committee members, without a word, stood up, gathered their papers, and walked out of the hearing room. The exodus had begun. Kennedy, relentless, moved to his next revelation. Let's go back to 2007. You've just become Speaker of the House. The Visa credit card company is terrified. A Democratic Congress could regulate their exorbitant fees, costing them billions. So, they launch a lobbying campaign. The Visa CEO gets a private meeting with you. Madam Speaker, no notes are released. And then, something special happens. Paul Pelosi is offered a chance to buy pre-IPO shares in Visa's upcoming public offering, an opportunity reserved for the most powerful and connected insiders. He let that sink in. He buys millions of dollars worth. And for the next 4 years, every single piece of legislation that would have regulated credit card fees dies in committee. It never even gets a vote. Visa is protected. The next slide showed the stock's performance. And the Pelosis make millions, while American small businesses and consumers pay the highest credit card fees in the developed world. He fast-forwarded. July 2024. Your husband sells $500,000 in Visa stock. 2 months later, the Justice Department files a massive antitrust lawsuit against the company. Perfect timing. Again. A woman in the gallery stood. I own a bakery in your district. Congresswoman, she said, her voice trembling with fury. Visa's fees cost me $35,000 last year. That's my entire profit. You could have helped small businesses like mine. Instead, you protected Visa, because your family was getting rich off them. Another Democratic committee member, a 20-year veteran, stood up. He looked at Pelosi, his face etched with pain. I can't defend this anymore. Nancy, he said quietly. He picked up his nameplate and walked out. 2 others immediately followed him. Pelosi was now sitting almost entirely alone at the massive Democratic table. The final example was Google. December 2022. Your husband sells $3 million worth of Google stock. Less than a month later, the Justice Department announces a major antitrust lawsuit against Google. Kennedy turned to face the committee members who remained. 4 major trades: Microsoft, Nvidia, Visa, Google. 4 instances of statistically impossible timing, all perfectly aligned with major government actions that you, Congresswoman, had advance knowledge of. He held up a document. A probability theorist at MIT calculated the odds of this trading record occurring by luck. He concluded that it is 34 times more likely that your husband would win the Powerball lottery than achieve these results by chance. Kennedy's voice dropped, forcing the silent room to lean in. So, Congresswoman, that leaves us with only 2 possibilities. Either your husband is the luckiest human being in the history of financial markets, or he is trading on non-public information that you are providing to him. Which is it? Pelosi's mouth opened and closed, but no sound emerged. She sat completely alone, her aides gone, her allies fleeing, trapped by a simple question for which there was no innocent answer. Having cornered Pelosi on the statistical impossibility of her husband's trading record, Kennedy paused. He allowed the accusation of insider trading to hang in the air, a toxic cloud that had settled over the committee room. The silence was absolute. Pelosi sat motionless, her face a pale, expressionless mask. She had no defense, no rebuttal. The numbers were undeniable. Kennedy's voice softened, taking on an almost sympathetic tone, but it was the feigned gentleness of a hunter laying a new, more insidious trap. But perhaps, Congresswoman, you needed all this money. Perhaps serving the public for 38 years is an expensive proposition. Perhaps, despite your congressional salary, you struggle financially. He reached for a new folder. An image appeared on the projection screen. It was not a financial document, but a photograph of 2 massive, commercial-grade, stainless steel refrigerators, gleaming under professional kitchen lights. These refrigerators, Kennedy noted, his voice carefully neutral, cost $24,000. The price of a new car. A full year of college tuition at a state university. A down payment on a house for a young family. For refrigerators. The next image showed Nancy Pelosi on a late-night talk show, smiling broadly, clearly enjoying herself as she opened those same refrigerators, revealing them to be packed, floor to ceiling, with pint after pint of Jenny's splendid ice creams. $13 a pint, Kennedy specified, letting the price resonate. Most Americans buy ice cream for $3 or $4. Hers costs $13. He played the video clip. Pelosi's cheerful, delighted voice filled the room. This is my stash. I don't know what I would have done if ice cream hadn't been invented. The host, James Corden, laughed along. It was a light, fun, humanizing moment. Kennedy stopped the video. He pulled out a newspaper. The headline stark and brutal. 22 million Americans unemployed. Food bank lines stretch for miles. The screen split. On the left, Pelosi, carefree and laughing with her luxury ice cream. On the right, a grim, black and white photograph of a line of cars stretching to the horizon, waiting for a box of basic food. Shall we discuss, Congresswoman? Kennedy's voice dropped to a whisper. What you were doing while Americans were starving. He began to paint 2 pictures, his voice taking on the cadence of a storyteller. Picture 1. April 14, 2020. A gated mansion in Pacific Heights, San Francisco. You're comfortable. You're safe. You're laughing with a talk show host about your $24,000 freezers being restocked with $13 a pint ice cream. He paused. Picture 2. A church parking lot in Detroit, Michigan. Cars are lined up for miles. Families have been waiting for 5 hours for a box of canned food. Mothers are trying not to cry where their children can see them. He let the brutal contrast sink in. Same day, same country. One woman showing off her stash of ice cream. Another woman trying to figure out how to feed her children. A woman in the gallery stood, her eyes red-rimmed and swollen. It was Maria Gonzalez, the woman whose restaurant had been featured in the photographs of the homeless encampment. "My name is Maria Gonzalez," she said, her voice shaking but determined. She held up a photo of a small, warm, inviting restaurant. "This was my life. Maria's kitchen. My husband and I built it with our hands. Our savings. Our dreams." Her voice began to break. "When COVID hit, we were forced to close. But I had a plan. The PPP loan. I applied for $50,000. Just enough to pay my staff. To keep the lights on. To keep the dream alive until we could reopen." She pulled out a timeline, reading the dates like a countdown to disaster. April 7th, I applied. April 9th, Republicans tried to pass emergency funding for the PPP. You blocked it, Ms. Pelosi. You said you needed more oversight. April 14th, you posted your ice cream video. Her voice hardened with anger. April 23rd, still no funding. I can't pay my rent. On April 29th, my bank foreclosed. She held up a second photograph. It showed her restaurant, but this time with a large foreclosure notice taped to the door. Standing in front of it were her 3 children, their faces streaked with tears. "My family lived in our car for 4 months," she said, her voice breaking completely. 4 months. While I looked for work. My children did their homework by streetlight. All because you delayed the funding for 3 weeks. For politics." She held up 2 final images, a screenshot of Pelosi's ice cream tweet. Time stamped April 14th, 3:47 p.m., and a photo of her own eviction notice. Dated April 14th, 4:15 p.m., same day. She sobbed. Others in the gallery stood, their voices overlapping in a chorus of pain. A plumber who now lived in his truck. A baker whose 3-generation family business had died. A veteran who had survived 2 tours in Afghanistan but whose barbershop couldn't survive Pelosi's political delay. Kennedy let the raw testimony fill the room, then raised his hand for silence. 18 businesses in this room alone. Congresswoman, 18 families destroyed because you played politics with their survival. He pulled out statements from progressive organizations, groups that had once been her staunchest allies, now condemning her tone-deaf display of wealth. He played a clip of Jon Stewart excoriating her for the hypocrisy. He was dismantling her political identity from the left and the right simultaneously. Finally, he returned to the core of his argument. "Let's discuss your wealth, Congresswoman," he said, and a timeline of her net worth appeared on the screen. A staggering climb from an already wealthy $10 million in 1987 to over $250 million today. Your congressional salary for 38 years totals about $8.5 million. Kennedy stated, even if you'd saved every penny, never paid a tax, never bought food or a single one of your designer suits, you'd be nowhere near $250 million. Where did the other $242 million come from? He let the question hang in the air, a $250 million question for which there was no innocent answer. He then gestured to the grim photographs of her district, which had reappeared on the screen. "Perhaps you earned it through your excellent service. Perhaps your district thrived under your leadership." The sarcasm was subtle, but devastating. "Let's visit your district, Congresswoman," Kennedy said quietly. "The district you've represented for 38 years. The one that made you a multimillionaire. Let's see what 38 years of your leadership has made for them." The screen faded to black, ready to display the next chapter in the indictment. The decay and destruction of San Francisco. The screen behind Kennedy, which had been dark, came to life not with charts or text, but with a horrifying montage of photographs. Kennedy remained silent, letting the images speak for themselves. The gallery watched in stunned silence. There were sprawling tent cities consuming entire blocks of what had once been prime commercial real estate. There were images of human feces on sidewalks, a casual and unavoidable part of the urban landscape. Used hypodermic needles were scattered in a children's playground sandbox. A homeless man was captured defecating against a wall in broad daylight as people walked past, their faces averted, The windows of nearly every car on a block were smashed. Storefronts were boarded up, their doors chained. For lease, signs peeling from the windows. The images were a relentless procession of urban decay. A visual testament to a city that had lost control. After a full, uncomfortable minute, Kennedy's voice, quiet and somber, filled the room. In 1987, he said, as the screen shifted to show archival footage, the year Congresswoman Pelosi first took office. San Francisco was a jewel. The old footage showed clean streets, thriving small businesses, families walking hand in hand. It was a city of hope, of innovation, the epicenter of the dawning tech boom, a place people were proud to call home. Now, he said simply, and the screen returned to the modern images of decay. Today, in 2025, after 38 years of your leadership, your district is an international symbol of urban failure, a cautionary tale featured in news reports around the world. He began to lay out the facts. In 1987, there were approximately 3,000 homeless people on the streets of San Francisco. Today, the official number is over 17,000. Though everyone knows the real number is much higher. The homeless population has increased by more than 5 times under your watch. A new chart appeared, showing city spending. Over the last 15 years, the city has spent over $4 billion on homelessness. $4 billion. And where did that money go? A list of city contractors and nonprofits appeared. Next to each name was the total amount of their campaign contributions to Nancy Pelosi's political campaigns. The pattern was undeniable. The people getting rich off the homeless crisis, Kennedy stated, were the same people funding your political career. A homelessness industrial complex, getting rich off of human suffering. He then detailed the policies Pelosi had championed. 2014, Proposition 47, which you publicly supported, downgraded theft under $950 to a misdemeanor. The result? Security footage played, showing teams of thieves brazenly walking into stores, filling garbage bags with merchandise, and walking out, knowing they would face no consequences. Walgreens closed 17 stores. Nordstrom closed its flagship location. Hundreds of small businesses went bankrupt. You didn't just tolerate theft, Congresswoman. You effectively legalized it. He moved to Proposition 57, an early release initiative for nonviolent offenders. You supported this, too, Kennedy noted, even though nonviolent included crimes like assault with a deadly weapon. Career criminals were back on the streets within days of their arrest. He quoted San Francisco's district attorney, an official Pelosi had endorsed, whose office had a stated policy of not prosecuting public camping, public urination, prostitution, or open-air drug use. You didn't just fail to stop the decay, you actively created the policies that incentivized it. He showed 2 photos side by side. One was of Pelosi's pristine, walled mansion in Pacific Heights, protected by private security. The other was of a tent city in the Tenderloin district. You don't live in the nightmare you created, Kennedy observed. You live in luxury, protected by walls and guards, while your constituents live in hell. An elderly man stood in the gallery, his body straight and proud despite his age. He wore an old army jacket, a purple heart pinned to its chest. Sergeant James Martinez, he said, his voice strong. United States Army. 2 tours in Iraq. I came home to your district in 2006. Lost my job in the crash. Lost my apartment. I found myself on Market Street with nowhere to go. He held up a photo of a man sleeping on the sidewalk, using a backpack as a pillow. That's me. I slept on that sidewalk for 3 years. The city spent hundreds of millions on homelessness during that time. I never saw a cent of it. He held up a second photograph that made the room gasp. It showed Nancy Pelosi, in an elegant evening gown, stepping carefully around the sleeping figures on the sidewalk to get to a limousine. One of those figures was unmistakably Sergeant Martinez. That's me, Ms. Pelosi, he said, his voice steady but carrying a universe of pain. You stepped over me to get to your $1,000 a-plate fundraiser. I survived 2 tours in Iraq. I survived IEDs and firefights. But I couldn't survive in your district. He held up his purple heart. This is what I got for my service to this country. Then he pointed to the screen showing Pelosi's mansion. That is what you got for yours. Before the room could recover, another woman stood, scars visible on her face. "My name is Jennifer Park. I'm a teacher in your district." She held up a photo of herself, smiling and vibrant. Then she held up a second photo, taken in a hospital bed, her face swollen and bruised almost beyond recognition. "In June of 2022, I was walking home from school and was assaulted and raped by a homeless man who had been reported to the police 15 times but was never arrested. Thanks to your DA's policies." She projected her phone's call log onto the screen. It showed 47 calls to Nancy Pelosi's congressional office. 47 times I called, begging for help. 47 times. No one called me back. She then showed a screenshot of Pelosi's Twitter account from the same day as her 47th call. "Looking forward to tonight's fundraiser at the French Laundry. While I sat in my apartment, too afraid to go outside," Jennifer sobbed. "You were posting on Twitter about your $1,000 a plate dinner." The room erupted in a chorus of pain from other constituents, their stories of crime, loss, and neglect overlapping. Kennedy let them speak, letting Pelosi absorb the full weight of her constituents' suffering. Finally, he raised his hand for silence. "These are your people, Congresswoman," he said, his voice a low, moral judgment. "While you made $250 million, while you showed off your luxury ice cream, while you traded stocks with impossible timing, they suffered. They lost their businesses, their safety, their homes, their dreams." He closed the folder on San Francisco's decay and paused, looking exhausted and sad. "Your district is a disaster. 38 years of your leadership has led to ruin. And yet, you are one of the wealthiest people in America." He looked directly at her. "So, let me ask you one final question." He opened his thickest, final folder. The screen went black, then lit up with a single, devastating line of text. The $250 million question. How does someone on a public servant's salary become a quarter billionaire? The screen behind Kennedy, which had been dark, now illuminated with the cold, brutal logic of simple arithmetic. Each line appeared separately, allowing the audience to process the staggering calculation. 38 years in Congress x $223.000 average annual salary equals $8.474.000. Stated net worth, 2025, equals $250.000.000. Unexplained difference equals $241.526.000. And finally, a single word appeared below the massive discrepancy. A question that hung in the silent room. How? Kennedy stood at the presentation screen, looking less like a senator and more like a forensic accountant about to deliver a final, damning audit. "We are going to answer that question, Congresswoman," he said, his voice carrying the weight of irrefutable evidence. "We are going to trace the dollars. We are going to show this committee, and the American people, exactly how a public servant on a government salary becomes a quarter billionaire." He clicked to the first slide, an aerial photograph of a sprawling estate in Napa Valley. "Let's start with real estate. In 1999, you and your husband purchased this vineyard estate for $2.5 million. Today, it is valued at over $25 million. He paused. "An excellent investment, but how did a congresswoman and a venture capitalist of, at the time, relatively modest means, afford such a purchase? And more importantly, how did you know to buy right before the Napa Valley real estate market exploded in value? Lucky timing, perhaps." Let's continue. Images of commercial buildings in San Francisco appeared. Over the next decade, your husband purchased multiple commercial properties in the city. Again, excellent investments, now valued at a combined $25 million. But notice the pattern. A timeline appeared on screen. Every single property was purchased in an area that subsequently received millions in federal development money you helped secure. Every single one was in a zone that later received favorable rezoning from the city. Every purchase was perfectly positioned to maximize its value based on future government action. A man in the gallery, dressed in an expensive suit, stood. "I competed against Paul Pelosi for 20 years. He said, his voice confident. "My name is Richard Thornton. I've developed property in San Francisco since 1995. And I can tell you, that man always knew. He always knew which neighborhoods would get new transit grants. Which areas would be upzoned? We used to joke that he had a crystal ball. But it wasn't a crystal ball. It was his wife in Congress. Kennedy nodded grimly and continued. But the empire isn't limited to your husband. Your husband's brother, Ronald Pelosi, is a major contractor in California. His companies have won over $50 million in state contracts over the last 2 decades. A flow diagram appeared on screen, showing a perfect, self-sustaining loop. You, Congresswoman, secure federal grants for California. The state receives the money and awards contracts. Your brother-in-law's company wins a disproportionate number of those contracts. His company then makes large donations to your campaign. The family profits at every stage. He clicked to the next slide. Your son, Paul Pelosi Jr., sits on the board of multiple companies. NRG Lab, which received a $10 million Department of Energy grant while you served on the relevant oversight committee. This Coil Group, which received EPA contracts during your term on the Appropriations Committee. All perfectly legal, all completely corrupt. A family tree appeared on screen, with staggering dollar amounts attached to each name. The husband, over $200 million. The brother-in-law, $50 million in contracts. The son, tens of millions in board fees and stock options. A Democratic senator, a man who had served with Pelosi for over 2 decades and was considered a close ally, slowly stood. His face was a mask of pain. Madam Speaker, he said, his voice shaking, I have defended you for 30 years. I believed in you, but I cannot defend this. You became the very corruption we swore to fight. He picked up his briefcase and walked out of the hearing room. 2 other Democrats immediately followed him. Kennedy pressed on, returning to the stock trades. In 2012, you voted for and praised the Stock Act, a law designed to stop congressional insider trading. You called it a shining light on a gaping hole in our ethics laws. Footage played of Pelosi at the signing ceremony, smiling and celebrating. And then, Kennedy said, his voice hard, you ignored it, not the letter of the law, but its entire spirit. The impossibly timed trades, Microsoft, Nvidia, Visa, Google, all happened after you passed the law to stop exactly this behavior. He played another clip, this one of Jon Stewart. How does she get away with it? Congress regulates Congress. They police themselves and, surprisingly, find themselves innocent every time. He concluded with a final, brutal comparison. Martha Stewart went to federal prison for a single insider trade that netted her about $45,000. You and your husband have made hundreds of millions through a pattern of trades with timing that defies statistical probability. Martha Stewart went to prison. You got rich. The only difference is that Martha Stewart couldn't vote on her own punishment. He looked directly at Pelosi, his voice rising with a moral fury he had restrained all day. You claimed to fight for working families. But you built an empire on their backs. You claimed to battle Wall Street. But you took their money and protected their interests. You are the swamp. You are the insider dealing. You are the elite contempt for working people you claim to oppose. You have become everything you once said you were fighting against. The defection of her longtime ally was a mortal blow. But the attack that followed was one from which there could be no recovery. An elderly black man stood in the gallery, his movements careful but determined. He wore a well-kept suit, and his face carried the weight of history and personal disappointment. I knew your father, he said, his voice carrying a quiet authority that instantly silenced the room. Thomas D'Alessandro Jr. I worked with him in the political world of Baltimore in the 1960s. He was a man of the people, a true public servant. He cared about working families, about the people who had nothing. The man's voice grew hard with a sorrowful anger. You have betrayed his legacy. Everything he believed in, everything he fought for, you threw it away for money and for power. You became everything he fought against. The words struck Pelosi with a force that none of Kennedy's financial data had. This was not a political opponent, this was a voice from her own past. From her own family's legacy. Delivering a moral verdict, tears began to flow down her face again. But these were different, not tears of rage, but of what looked, for the first time, like genuine shame. I served my country, she whispered, the words barely audible, the last, hollow defense of a woman with nothing left. Kennedy, seeing his opening for the final assault, pulled out his last set of documents. His voice was low, almost somber, like a judge about to read a sentence. "You claim to fight for working families," he began, "but for 38 years. That was a brand, not a belief. You claim to battle Wall Street, but you took their money and protected their interests. Donation records from Wells Fargo, J.P. Morgan Chase, and Bank of America flashed on the screen, millions of dollars that flowed to her campaigns right after she had publicly excoriated them for their role in the financial crisis." Kennedy's voice rose, not in volume, but in intensity. "You became what you claimed to fight. You are the swamp. You are the insider dealing. You are the elite contempt for working people that you railed against. Every single thing you said you opposed, you became." He looked directly at her, his expression now one of profound, almost sorrowful disappointment. "Your net worth is $250 million. The average American household has savings of about $62,000. You have 4,000 times more wealth than the people you claim to represent." He began his final summary, each line a hammer blow, a contrast between her life and theirs. "While their city crumbled, you got rich. While they suffered, you accumulated wealth beyond imagination. While they lost everything, you traded stocks with impossible timing. While they stood in food bank lines, you showed off your luxury ice cream. While they begged your office for help, you attended $1,000 a plate dinners. While their children slept on the streets, your children wanted for nothing." The room was completely still. The totality of the indictment, financial, political, and moral, was complete. Kennedy gathered his papers with the same methodical care he'd shown at the beginning. A sign that he was truly finished. "The committee has everything now. The FBI has been notified. The Justice Department is investigating. Your own party is, as we speak, meeting to discuss your expulsion from the caucus." He paused, letting the finality of it land. "Your career is over, Congresswoman." He then delivered the final, most devastating blow. He held up one last document. "This is a criminal referral, received by my office this morning, from the Federal Bureau of Investigation to the Department of Justice. It recommends prosecution for a pattern of suspicious trading, potential conspiracy, and a systematic abuse of your public position for personal enrichment." He looked at her, and the expression in his eyes might have been pity. "You are 84 years old, Congresswoman. At your age?" He didn't need to finish the sentence. Everyone in the room understood the terrifying implication. Any significant federal prison sentence would be a life sentence. As Kennedy packed his briefcase, Pelosi, in a final, desperate act of self-preservation, called out, her voice cracking, "Wait, we can make a deal. I have information about others. I can." Kennedy paused at the door, but he did not turn around. "The time for deals passed decades ago, Congresswoman," he said, his voice carrying back into the silent room. "You had 38 years to do the right thing. You chose differently. Now, you'll live with those choices." He left. With his departure, the last bit of fight, the last spark of life, went out of Nancy Pelosi. She sat alone at the witness table, abandoned by her staff, her supporters, and her colleagues. The committee room that had been her kingdom for decades had become her courtroom. And the verdict was in. Guilty. The complete and total destruction of Nancy Pelosi's career was not an accident. Nor was it simply the result of a single, explosive revelation. It was a masterclass in asymmetric political warfare, a meticulously planned and executed prosecution that stands as a seminal example of how to dismantle a seemingly untouchable political titan. The confrontation was a clash of two fundamentally different approaches to power. Pelosi entered the hearing wielding the conventional weapons of the modern political establishment: overwhelming force, personal invective, institutional authority, and the mobilization of a loyal base. Her strategy was to create a spectacle of dominance, to humiliate her opponent so thoroughly from the outset that any counter-arguments would be dismissed as the desperate flailing of a defeated man. Senator Kennedy, in contrast, chose to fight on an entirely different battlefield. He understood that he could not win a battle of volume, of celebrity, or of partisan loyalty. Instead, he chose the terrain of verifiable fact and moral clarity. His strategy was not to overpower Pelosi, but to methodically dismantle the very foundation of her power, piece by piece. until the entire edifice collapsed under its own weight. The success of this strategy rested on several key pillars. First and foremost was the strategy of stillness. Kennedy's initial refusal to react to Pelosi's barrage of insults was not a sign of weakness, but his opening strategic move. This rope-a-dope defense accomplished two critical objectives. It allowed Pelosi to overextend herself, to become increasingly shrill and emotionally unregulated. The longer her tirade went on unanswered, the more it began to look less like a powerful indictment and more like a desperate, one-sided performance. It created a powerful visual and tonal contrast for the audience, her emotional chaos versus his rational calm. Before Kennedy even presented a single piece of evidence, he had already framed himself as the sober adult in the room, subtly manipulating the audience's perception and priming them to see him as the more credible actor. The second pillar was the power of the tangible. In an era of digital spin, deepfakes, and ephemeral social media narratives, Kennedy grounded his entire case in physical, verifiable evidence. His manila folders were not just props, they were weapons. Each time he reached for a new document, the 8x10 photograph of the homeless encampment, the stack of 50 more, the highlighted financial statements, the MIT professor's probability analysis, he was anchoring his argument in a reality that could not be dismissed. The projector screen was his most effective weapon, transforming abstract accusations into undeniable visual proof. The audience didn't just hear that Paul Pelosi made $38 million, they saw the number in a stark, bold font that filled their field of vision. They didn't just hear that Pelosi's district was in decay, they saw the heartbreaking images of human suffering. This relentless presentation of tangible evidence short-circuited Pelosi's ability to reframe the debate into a matter of partisan opinion. Third was the masterstroke of narrative sequencing and escalation. Kennedy did not begin with his most damning evidence. He constructed his case like a skilled prosecutor, building it layer by layer, ensuring each revelation landed with maximum impact. Phase 1 was to undermine her credibility. The photographs of San Francisco directly contradicted her opening monologue about California's greatness, immediately putting her on the defensive and proving that her perception of her own district was, at best, a fantasy. Phase 2 was to establish a pattern of deception. The stock trades, beginning with the statistically impossible, luck, and escalating to the more overtly corrupt, pay-for-play, schemes, established a clear pattern of unethical, if not illegal, behavior. Crucially, he then moved to Phase 3, humanize the victims. He did not allow the hearing to remain a debate about abstract numbers. The testimonies of Robert Chen, the small investor who lost his son's college fund, Sarah Goldstein, the bakery owner crushed by visa fees, Maria Gonzalez, whose business died during the PPP delay, and Sergeant Martinez, the homeless veteran, were the moral heart of the prosecution. They transformed Pelosi's actions from political gamesmanship into acts that caused profound and lasting human suffering. This made it impossible for her allies to defend her actions as simply how the game is played. Finally, he delivered the moral and legal coup de grace. The defections of her own allies, the denunciation by the civil rights veteran, and the final reveal of the criminal referral from the FBI were the closing arguments. By that point, her guilt in the court of public opinion was so firmly established that the threat of legal consequences was merely a formality. Kennedy's strategy was not to win a shouting match, but to build a prison of facts around his opponent. He used Pelosi's own words, her own financial records, her own policy failures, and the pain of her own constituents as the bars of the cell. His victory was a quiet one, a testament to the idea that in the end, the weight of the truth, when presented methodically and relentlessly, can be a force more powerful than any political dynasty. The fall of Nancy Pelosi was more than just the end of a single, powerful career. It was a seismic event that sent shockwaves through the entire political ecosystem, shattering long-held assumptions about power, accountability, and the very nature of corruption in modern America. The hearing and its aftermath established a new and dangerous precedent for the political establishment, leaving a permanent scar on the landscape of Washington. The most significant consequence was the public shattering of the legal corruption defense. For decades, a certain type of corruption has flourished in Washington, operating in the gray area between the unethical and the explicitly illegal. Politicians have enriched themselves and their families through practices that, while morally repugnant to the average citizen, were technically legal and properly disclosed: perfectly timed stock trades, lucrative board positions for family members, and the unspoken exchange of legislative favors for campaign donations. The standard defense has always been, as Pelosi attempted, "My investments are legal and have been publicly disclosed." Kennedy's prosecution was a direct and successful assault on that fortress of cynical legality. He effectively argued that the court of public opinion operates under a higher law than the U.S. Code. The central question of the hearing was not, did she break the law? But, did she betray the public trust? By winning this argument so decisively, Kennedy fundamentally changed the rules of the game. He demonstrated that a politician could be destroyed not by an indictment from the DOJ, but by an indictment from the American people, based on evidence of profound ethical failure. The hearing exposed the business as usual of Washington not as a sophisticated game for insiders, but as a systemic rot that preys on ordinary citizens. Secondly, the event marked the implosion of the partisan shield. A core tenet of modern politics is that tribal loyalty supersedes all other considerations. A politician under attack, no matter how credible the accusations, can typically rely on their party to close ranks, circle the wagons, and dismiss the charges as a purely partisan witch hunt. Pelosi certainly expected this. What she did not anticipate was that the evidence presented would be so overwhelming, so visually and emotionally powerful, that it would breach the walls of partisanship. The slow, steady defection of her Democratic colleagues, first the quiet exits, then the pained public denunciations, was perhaps the most shocking development of the day. It demonstrated that there is, in fact, a limit to partisan loyalty. When confronted with irrefutable evidence of corruption that is not just abstract but visually represented by the suffering of sympathetic victims, the homeless veteran, the grieving mother, the bankrupted small business owner, the political calculus of self-preservation can override tribal instinct. The Democratic Party did not abandon her out of a sudden crisis of conscience. They abandoned her because they understood that defending her was politically indefensible and would permanently taint their own brand. Finally, the hearing served as a profound reckoning for the media. Kennedy's presentation was an implicit indictment not only of Pelosi but of the entire media ecosystem that had enabled her for decades. For years, the press had largely accepted Pelosi's narrative of herself as a master legislator and a champion of the people, while failing to rigorously investigate the statistical impossibility of her husband's trading record, the clear conflicts of interest with her family's businesses, or the catastrophic decline of her own district. These were not state secrets, but publicly available or easily discoverable facts that were largely ignored in favor of covering the daily political horse race. It took an insider, another senator, to perform the basic function of investigative journalism that the press had abdicated. The hearing exposed the media's complicity, demonstrating how they had amplified her power and shielded her from scrutiny. The legacy of the Pelosi-Kennedy hearing, therefore, is a new and volatile playbook for political accountability. It provides a model for how a well-prepared challenger, armed with tangible evidence and a clear moral narrative, can bypass traditional media gatekeepers and appeal directly to the public. It raises the terrifying question for the establishment: was this a singular event? A perfect storm of a uniquely compromised politician meeting a uniquely skilled opponent? Or does it signal the dawn of a new, more transparent, and far more brutal era in American politics, where no one, no matter how powerful, is truly safe from a reckoning? The precedent has been set, and the walls of the kingdom have been breached.